Welcome. I'm Michael Bickert. Thanks for joining me today as we explore concepts with the objective of improving your management skills and growing your business. Pause the video right now so that you can grab a notepad and a pen and then make a commitment that you'll jot something down throughout this video, something that you will implement today in your business. We want to implement things every day. There's no sense in meeting or having a discussion or exploring a new concept if you're not going to commit to taking away an action item, something that you can implement right away. Today I want to speak about an unglamorous subject, and that is boundaries. And I would really encourage you not to stop the video and go away if the term boundaries sounds boring to you. I want to convince you today that developing and practicing good boundaries in your life, in your personal life, and throughout your business will be paramount in your success. Well, if not paramount, it'll be one of the critical aspects. And let's look a little bit deeper as to what am I talking about when I talk about boundaries. When you think about boundaries in terms of everyday colloquial speak, you think of maybe borders for our country, and maybe there's boundaries between your house and your neighbor's yard, and even within the office that you're in right now, you have boundaries, which are the walls that define the space that you operate in. And so what we're talking about today for boundaries will be those borders and those protective barriers and things, maybe walls, between yourself and other people that are designed to protect you. And protect you from what? When we're thinking in the context of business or in relationships, what do you need to be protected from? Well, some kind of emotional injury. In business, I think what often we're trying to protect, or what manifests as a symptom for those who lack boundaries, is the inability to be effective in proceeding with what is most important in your business. And other people can, if you explore this and you do some introspection and you ponder for a moment why it is that you don't always proceed with those things you need to do. Sometimes you will find that it's due to others in your life, others in your business, who are presenting competing demands, and you are very habitually acquiescing to those demands and putting off what you know you should be doing. So that's what we're talking about. And so that protection is protecting your business. You owe it to yourself, you owe it to your business and the stakeholders in your business to be successful, to drive growth in your business. So let's have a review once again about who are the stakeholders in your business, because the stakeholders are the very people that you need to practice good boundaries with. And this principle, by the way, will work in your personal life and your professional life. In fact, all good habits of effective people are equally applicable in personal and professional life. So once again, the review of the stakeholders in your business is, of course, yourself and your business partners, the shareholders in your business, those who own a piece of the business. And then you have your team, which we can break down into your management team and the operational and frontline staff who make things happen day to day. And then sometimes you have contract workers and freelancers, occasional like temporary workers and casual labor. And you have your vendors and the people that provide you with things for your business. And that could include your landlord, and it could include suppliers and so forth. And of course, your customers are stakeholders in your business. And then I always say the surrounding community. So are you practicing good boundaries with each of those people? And as you reflect on this later and you try to implement the practice of good boundaries in your business, and it is practice. This is something that isn't just about knowledge. It's not like I'll share something with you and you'll realize, oh, now I know how to do it, and it's game over. Now I'll just be excellent. It's not like that with almost anything in life. You have to practice. So you have to implement what we're talking about today, day in and day out. And you're going to start off being, with not very good skills. And then with all things that you practice, you'll find that you get better and better. And it takes discipline. Don't give up on this. This will improve you. So when you think about those stakeholders, let's think of some examples that may manifest as symptoms of ineffectiveness in your business and prohibit you from being successful. So perhaps you have a business partner who is not carrying their weight. They're not upholding their end of the agreement in terms of what you had hoped when you became business partners, that each of you would contribute in some way, and somebody is not. If you're not saying anything, and that is a chronic problem, that's a symptom of a boundary issue. You're not protecting yourself and your interest in the business, maybe because you're afraid to speak with this person, and that's has to do with the lack of boundaries in your relationship. Another one might be, say, with a landlord. If the landlord was being unreasonable with you, or was raising your rent and you failed to do anything about it, it may be that you have a lack of boundaries. And in fact, contractual agreements such as a lease and other types of contracts can be a form of exercising a boundary. What about with your customers? Do you sometimes have abusive customers who manipulate the system, or maybe you allow people within your organization to be abusive to your customers and you lose customers? These are all examples of where you're not practicing good boundaries. And you need a culture throughout everyone, all the stakeholders, certainly all the internal people in your business, that practices boundaries. So I just wanted to explore the notion of practicing a boundary in terms of what it really means. And I've seen so often that people think that implementing a boundary with somebody or with some other stakeholders has to do with changing someone else's behavior. That is not the case at all. You cannot control, and you know this, you cannot control what other people do. And you can't even control the response of other people to what you do. The only thing you can control is what you do and your response to what other people do. And so, of course, boundaries become all about what you're going to do in certain situations. So the first thing I want you to think about in terms of boundaries, I guess you have to sit down and think about some symptoms in your life, in your business, that may be an indication that you have not had good boundaries set up with people that you communicate with and that you interact with from day to day. Once you start to think about that, then you can explore, well, what can I do about that? The first rule I want to give you in terms of implementing boundaries and a better practice of boundaries is never do this while you're emotional. So often this topic comes up when something occurs, some kind of confrontation where you get frustrated, maybe even angry, that you realize we have no boundaries, and then you lash out at a person or somebody lashed out at you, and then it's like, okay, now I'm going to put my foot down and I'm going to change things. We're going to get better at this. That's not the time to do this. You need to work on boundaries and creating this new habit when emotions are low, when cooler heads are prevailing, and there is no confrontation. So if you've identified, as an example, that somebody does cross a line with you in terms of their communication style, maybe they're abusive, or maybe they just take you for granted, and it's causing problems and it's frustrating for you, wait until things are going really well and you're communicating well, and then broach the subject and say to them, I'm working on myself, and make it about you, not about them. That's an important best practice as well. I'm working on myself and I'm trying to become more effective in my personal and professional life. And one of the things I've been studying is boundaries. So I'm talking to all the people in my life, the various stakeholders and people with whom I have relationships, and I'm just letting them know so that they can help me with my behavior And I'm letting them know that I'm establishing some new boundaries. And when I've considered our relationship, I've noticed from time to time that X, Y, or Z happens. If we want to use an example, occasionally I find myself having a hard time saying no to you when in fact I should be working on something that is maybe more pressing and more important for the business or for the running of the home or whatever it is in whatever relationship you're referring to. And I know from the experts I've consulted on this that I need to become better at managing my time and prioritizing and saying no occasionally to those things that are less pressing and that aren't as important to my success and happiness. And so you'll probably notice in the future that I am going to be saying no to you more often. And I don't want you to take it personally. This is something I'm doing with everyone. And okay, so there's some word tracks. Now, the other part, besides making sure that you're doing this, let's just sort of review some of the things we've covered so far. You're doing it at a time, you're taking the opportunity to have a discussion proactively at a time before there's confrontation, or if there's already been confrontation, well after it's sort of smoothed over and emotions are not peaking, and it's not an incendiary conversation that you're going to have, not confrontational. And the second thing you're going to do is you're going to let them know that this is something that you're working on yourself. You're not trying to change that person, you're changing yourself. The third thing that I used in my word track there was help, the word help. And you're requesting help of another individual to help you improve yourself. And you know, people may be suspicious, they may be defensive and think it's about them. You can't control what they think. You can use best practices in your communication, but remember, you're being genuine when you say this is about you. You are trying to improve yourself and your effectiveness. Okay, the next thing you should consider is that your boundaries should be universal. Even though you may have, as I suggested, you've explored the various stakeholders and what symptoms may occur in your relationship, I don't want you to think of having different boundaries for different people. You want to have the same boundaries, you know, like when we use the analogy of the office walls that are there to protect your privacy and give you the opportunity to be more effective in working. The same thing goes for the emotional boundaries and the communication boundaries that you're setting up. They are universally applicable to all of your relationships. Now, it may not seem obvious because you're having certain interactions and you have certain relationships in which people don't violate naturally a particular boundary. They just sort of intuitively respect a boundary, and that it's somebody else who barges into your office or somebody else who gives you work that they should be doing and places it on you and has unrealistic expectations of you and sets unrealistic deadlines and those kinds of things. So you automatically think, well, I have to set boundaries with that person. And while that is true, the boundary itself that you define is universal to everyone. And you're going to uphold it without prejudice. You're going to uphold it the same for everyone. And it may be that you never have to address the issue with those who've never sort of infringed on that boundary before, and that there is a habitual or chronic offender, and that's the person that you probably need to have the conversation with and explain, but it's the same boundary across the board. So document these things. Start a digital document. If you're a pen and paper person, then okay. Jot these things down. You got to document it and save it somewhere because you're going to need to review these things from time to time. At first, when you set your boundaries, I recommend keeping that document somewhere that you can view frequently, at least every day. And then every time you have an interaction, review it and ask yourself, did you uphold your boundaries? Did you allow somebody to infringe on one of your boundaries? Or did you infringe on somebody else's boundary, or what you should honor as someone else's boundary? And I think the way to do that is to maybe open it on a tab. This isn't a secret. There should be nothing that you're afraid of or want to hide from anybody. So even if you had a printed piece of paper with your boundaries on it, somewhere in your home that other members of the family that are practicing these boundaries with you can see, or it's on your desk, or as I say, on a tab open on your browser. It's okay, because these are things that they shouldn't be secretive. These are things that you want to communicate and be transparent with other people on. Okay, so you're going to document these boundaries one at a time and just ask yourself, so what things are important to you that you need to protect yourself? What things sort of set you off and bring out the worst in you and you want to get better? Maybe you're becoming angry and you're losing your temper, and ask yourself, sort of back up, what things lead to that? Oh, when I get frustrated when a person does X, Y, or Z. So then what you say is, the first boundary is going to be, I will not tolerate a person doing the following behavior or whatever. So I can't say what that is in your case. You have to examine your own conscience and decide what it is that you're going to define as a violation of your boundary, and therefore define the boundary itself. The second part of it, though, and this is really, really important, is the consequence, because you can't control whether somebody will honor your boundaries or not. So what is the consequence of somebody violating, infringing on one of those boundaries, not honoring one of the boundaries? And so let's say you said, for example, that you would not tolerate the use of profanity when used in anger in a communication with somebody. You said that that's just intolerable. So you're defining that for someone. And then the consequence might be, if you choose to use profanity in anger in your communication with me, I will terminate the conversation at that point. I will go away, and then we can reconvene once you've cooled off a little bit and you're not using profanity, because it's just maybe a bad habit on their part, and you have to uphold that. And that's sort of the third thing. So let's just review that second part. You're going to document these things. They're the same for everyone. Your boundaries are universally applicable to every person in your life, and you define the consequence. The consequence is the critical part, because if you just know the boundary and you don't have any consequence, then all you'll be able to do is realize that somebody is violating the boundary. Somebody's infringing upon the boundary. It's like having a law where there's no consequence. It's like, okay, well, that person broke the law. Well, we can document that they broke the law, but there has to be some consequence. And you don't want to have sort of a passive-aggressive style where you tolerate somebody crossing the line with you. They don't realize they're crossing the line. Maybe you think they should realize it, but they don't. In fairness to everyone, you need to define those boundaries. And the passive-aggressive nature would be, I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, but where you're bottling everything up inside and you're sort of suppressing the frustration that is occurring, and then you sort of snap, and maybe you bite someone's head off at that moment, or you sever the relationship entirely. That's not the practice of a healthy boundary. Instead, what you would do, or ideally what you would do, is you would define these things that we said earlier in a non-emotional discussion with somebody, where you define the boundaries, you let them know it's about you, not them, and that you're having this conversation with everybody important to you so that they can help you improve yourself. And then you start to define, and you tell them, here are some of the things. And in the example I just gave, I don't want to be engaged in conversations where people use profanity out of anger. Now, you might tolerate some mild, or depending on your boundary, maybe even severe profanity that is in jest or used in a facetious, joking nature, or if somebody just has I'm going to call it a bad habit of using profanity, and they don't mean anything about it, like brah, effing this and effing that, and they're just chit-chatting very naturally using that language, and it's not offensive to you, it doesn't hurt you in any way, then that might be something that is perfectly tolerable within your boundary in that instance. So that's why I say the use of profanity out of anger is probably a little bit more specific. But these are your boundaries. You get to decide how to define them. And then the consequence is you will terminate the conversation. And you can be more specific. I'm giving you just examples here. You could say, I'm going to terminate the conversation, and we will not meet again, or we won't speak again for 24 hours, because that's what, you know, I need to sort of process the information and give some thought to what went into that. And that's just my personality. Remember, it's all about you. You could say that it was going to be a week before you speak again, or it could be even just a few minutes where people cool down. A person might say, I'm sorry, on the spot, I forgot. And you may have defined that that's the consequence. Okay. And you can continue. That is up to you. The consequences are up to you. The key about the consequences, though, is you cannot be selective in administering the consequences. You have to be consistent time and again. Otherwise, you will not establish a boundary. Okay. So when I earlier spoke about this is a habit that you have to develop through discipline and through practice, and you'll be unskilled in boundaries in the beginning and you'll get better. It is the consistent application of the consequences that makes you good at establishing boundaries. And, you know, we've been talking all about establishing boundaries, and that's the primary thing I want to get across in this video, but you will also become better at honoring other people's boundaries. In fact, you may, through osmosis, you may start to teach people that this is a better culture, a better way, a better means of communicating. And they will start to say, well, hey, you did this and that sort of ticks me off or whatever, and say, hey, I'm glad you brought that up. How would you like to handle that? And you can help them establish a boundary that they may like to do. And you say, I'll certainly honor that. But let's get back to you. So we've sort of identified some key areas where we're less effective because of poor boundaries. And then we start a document in which we list out, I'm going to say that you should probably have no fewer than 5 boundaries, but there is no set number. I just want you to put some effort into this. So start off with at least 5 boundaries. And, you know, I'd limit it to 10 in the beginning. So between 5 and 10, I think is a good place to start. Throughout your life, you may have many, many, many boundaries, some of which are only very rarely infringed upon. But of course, we have many boundaries, things that we would never tolerate, and you may not have to define those for 99.99% of the people. And then you meet some person who, whatever, just doesn't have the same sort of sense of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, that they're rude, or in your opinion or whatever, and you have to define something for them. And but for today, I'm saying, let's start with maybe 5 or 10, and each of them has a consequence. As we've spoken about in another video regarding accountability, there needs to be a progressive nature to consequences. So when we talk about consequences for your boundary, the first infraction that somebody has may be what you defined, but then it escalates over time. If the person was, again, a chronic offender, and that's essentially them saying, I don't care, or the consequence is not severe enough to change my behavior. I don't care enough about this. And they continue. In the example I gave, they get angry and they start swearing at you using profanity, and then you terminate the conversation. Later that afternoon, you start it again, and whatever, it's a contentious issue, you don't see eye to eye, and they start swearing again. The next time you're like, okay, well, we're going to terminate this conversation, as I mentioned, but we're not going to pick it up again. It has to be progressive in nature. So you might wait a day, 24 hours, or a week. You have to send the message that this is not a behavior that will be tolerated. If you have wiggle room, then work that into your boundary and define it as such. Don't make the wiggle room in the consequence. Make it in the boundary, in the definition of what you will and will not tolerate. Once somebody infringes on a boundary, they cross the line, you have to, without fail, with great discipline, administer the consequences, and they have to be progressive in nature. Am I saying that wrong? And they have to escalate, essentially. And so think of this concept that Stephen Covey talks about, where we have an emotional bank account, and the more people are communicating well with you and the relationship with you, they're making emotional deposits with you. That is, they're doing things for you, they're listening to you, they care about you, and it's a win-win relationship. It's a very healthy relationship. They are making emotional deposits into that bank account. Then if they make a withdrawal at some point where they cross a line, they've got so much on deposit with you that you're much more forgiving. Whereas somebody who's a stranger or who maybe is chronically crossing the line with you, they may fail to deposit much into your relationship, into that emotional bank account. And therefore, if they're making withdrawals every time, this is, an analogy, a metaphor, if they're making that emotional withdrawal that's very draining on you and it's hurtful to you, then you have to immediately shut it down. And that's where you would go to those more severe consequences with them. And in some cases, you are going to determine that you probably need to terminate a relationship entirely. Hopefully that's not in a critical business relationship, but it can be. It may be that you have to terminate a partnership. It may be that you have to terminate a relationship with a customer, the proverbial firing of the customer, maybe an abusive customer, or you may have to part ways and terminate somebody in your employ. These things are probably not going to be that common, but if you have really poor boundaries and you have really sort of quote unquote toxic relationships and people are not prepared to change, then you'll either have to change your surroundings and the people you interact with by moving on to something else, or if you're in a position to do so, you may have to ask them to leave and find someone to replace them. But it is critical that you are consistent in the application of your administering of your consequences, and you don't play favorites, but you can allow for a different response based on that emotional bank account. It may be that somebody sort of snapped at you and that person is somebody who you get along with famously 99.9% of the time, and you realize, oh, something must be up in their life or whatever. You should still let them know that they crossed the line or whatever, but you can say, is there something wrong? So you're still upholding your boundary at that point, but you're a little bit more tolerant in terms of the length of time, in terms of how severe the consequences are because of those emotional deposits they have with you. Those people who don't, like an absolute stranger who maybe got up in your face and crossed the line, you could shut that down very quickly. Now, I'm not telling you what those boundaries have to be. So if while you're hearing me use these examples, you think, oh, well, no, there's better ways to diffuse the situation, and I would do the following things. That's fine. That's your boundaries. That's based on your personality. And some people, this is really important to understand as well. That's why everyone has to set their own boundaries and define them themselves, is based on your upbringing, based on your paradigms, based on your personality, based on your tolerance for confrontation. You may need to have a completely different boundary than somebody else. There are some people who are sort of devil's advocate communicators. I'm one of them. And I've recently learned that's sort of the Socratic method of learning and to challenge things in communication style and everything. But that can grate on people and rub people the wrong way. And sometimes I'm contrarian by nature and I might challenge people. And I think it's all well and good and it's very good in terms of moving the conversation forward and I'm getting something out of it, but it's actually hurtful to them or they're becoming defensive and less effective. So we would have two boundaries in that case. They would have to exercise a different boundary than me, and they may have to terminate the conversation or say, well, no, I'm not going to tolerate this methodology or whatever. And I would have to honor that if I wanted to communicate with them. Whereas I could communicate with somebody else and it's going really well. So don't get hung up on my examples. Think about you personally. This is all about you improving and you becoming more effective. And in the time we have today, it's not likely that you will be able to learn all you need to know about boundaries. This is meant to sort of wet your whistle, get you started, and have you start to practice these things. I'm giving you a little homework to do. What I really recommend you do is pick up the book by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. I'll put a link in the description. And they wrote the book on boundaries. And they get into real details and they use lots of examples. It's very simple, and they justify the rationale behind how you implement these things in your life so well, and they articulate it so well that it's the type of thing that you should use as a reference material and go back. And they use all sorts of relationships, like spouses and children and parents and co-workers and the boss and the neighbor and somebody, all the various relationships in your life. They give examples of how people may infringe on a boundary and how and why you should implement the practice of defining that boundary and holding to it. So that's the best thing you could do and take away from this, is to go and get that book. And if you prefer, I'm sure it's available for audiobook as well. I'm going to leave it at that today. And there's almost assuredly a ton of information that I forgot to cover on this. So leave a comment if you want to explore this concept a little bit more in a future video, or if there's something about boundaries that you're unclear on or that you've implemented in your life that has been really good. Let's learn from one another. Perpetual refinement.